Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to join you here today. I wish I could be with all of you in person, but it's a great attendance that we have and really thrilled to do it. And as always, today we are releasing the annual Kansas Housing Markets Forecast Series. And so the theme that we had this year for our forecast was connections. It just seemed in the midst of everything that we're going through with the pandemic that we've really become so much more aware of how everything in our economy, everything in our personal lives and our professional lives touch in ways that we sometimes take for granted. And so we tried to play on that theme with our graphical elements. I hope that you enjoy that and appreciate it. As always, the forecasts are available at your local board offices. They should be delivered sometime today. And we have to give tremendous thanks to Security First, Meritrust, Fidelity Bank, Capital Federal, and Credit Union of America for being sponsors of the various forecast publications. So depending on which market you're in, there are different sponsors, and please make sure that you look at your forecasts and that you really give a big shout out and a thank you to the sponsors, because without them, it wouldn't be possible for us to put these together. And then I would always be remiss if I didn't thank the special relationship that we have with the Kansas Association of Realtors and the partnership we have. I think it's been 12 years now that we began doing these annual forecasts for the statewide, but we do that because we have a contract with the Kansas Association of Realtors that allows us to have access to all of the MLS systems across the state, and we then use those to put together the monthly MLS reports that you receive. By the way, I wanted to give a quick mention here. We are in the process of doing a total refresh and redesign of those, and we sent out a survey link to the recipients, people to whom we send those reports. And so I'll send out a reminder when the new reports go out here in the next few days. Please fill out that survey, give us feedback on what you like, what you don't like about the reports, and what you might like to see us add or take away so that we can make them as useful as possible as we can. But once again, thank you to the Kansas Association and to all the local MLS boards for making it possible for us to do this. So, as you know, I always like to go through the housing forecast by beginning with an economic overview, and I thought I would start with a review of what I wrote last year about the labor market and the mortgage market, the fundamentals that are underlying everything. And at the time, almost a year ago to the day, I said that fundamentals are really solid. Financing is widely available and very inexpensive, and the labor market was pretty healthy. But I added a little caveat last year, and I did this simply because I think we all felt a little bit like, what's over our shoulders? What's coming next? We really weren't sure. And so I said all of this could change very quickly. I had no clue how quickly and how extremely everything could change. And so this is a chart that shows the unemployment rate in the U.S. and in Kansas statewide. And the spikes that we saw back in April with the unemployment rate in the wake of the shutdowns with the COVID pandemic are absolutely unprecedented. Even in the midst of the Great Depression, we never saw unemployment spike so rapidly, so intensively. And the thing that I really want to highlight with this and with the jobs number slides that I have next is that even with the sharp decline in the unemployment rates that we've seen, here in Kansas, our unemployment rate is still higher right now than it was at the worst time during the Great Recession. And so even though it feels like it's maybe not as bad as it had been, it really is still quite stressing, and there are some underlying currents that I think we have to be conscious of and aware of as we look forward into next year and the following year. The one way we look at these, the labor market situation is at the unemployment rate. So that's households and do you have a job? The other way that we look at it is with the employment figures, which is looking at businesses and asking, how many people do you have on your payrolls? They don't paint exactly the same picture all of the time, but we see a very similar picture here right now. Job losses were very stark, very severe. And once again, even despite the increases that we've seen since as the shutdowns have eased a little bit, we're still at levels of jobs and we're still losing jobs compared to the prior year and at a pace that was greater than what we saw in the depths of the Great Recession. So it's easy for us to, I think, feel like things are getting better, but this is still a very, very severe, concerning economic situation. Just yesterday, the Center for Economic Development and Business Research released the annual employment forecasts for Kansas, Wichita, Topeka, and Kansas City. And the forecast that they have here is that on average this year, once we kind of balance everything out, we're going to see average job losses of 4.1% compared to where we were in 2019. And those figures, if you go back and you look, you can see that's on par with where we were in terms of total number of jobs back in 2013. So it's a really, really sharp and steep decline. And even with a 0.5 percentage point increase that they're forecasting for next year, we still haven't recovered to where we were in 2013. So, even through the end of next year, the CEDBR is not forecasting us to come back to where we were 8 years ago. Now, there's one other caveat that I want to give in terms of the employment forecast that the CEDBR released yesterday, which is that built into this forecast was an assumption that there would be further economic stimulus packages coming from the federal government. If that is not the case, they're actually forecasting further job losses for Kansas and all of our metro areas through the coming year. And part of that is driven by the fact that states are expected to experience severe tax revenue losses. I know we just had a release last week that the state's tax revenues were in excess of forecasted levels. But going forward, this level of economic stress will reduce income tax receipts in the future. It may end up putting some pressure on commercial property valuations, which would not start to show up until tax revenues next year. And it certainly has had an impact on retail sales. So there's going to be an impact there going forward. Well, then the other side, so labor markets, we have some concerns. One thing that doesn't show up in these charts is that I really believe that what we're seeing in this labor market right now is a magnification 1,000-fold of a story that's been playing out over the last decade or more, which is the tale of the haves and the have-nots. People who are in jobs where they are able to work remotely and do things distant, they are much less likely to have been affected. People who are working in jobs where it requires close personal contact are much more likely to have been affected. And it tends to be the former group that's more likely to be homeowners. And so that's why we haven't seen that impact of the labor market yet in the housing market and what we're seeing going forward. But we need to be aware that as the recession continues and as the unemployment continues to be continues at these high levels, that will have spillover effects in all aspects of the economy. And so we need to be concerned going forward. The other element that we have here is the mortgage rates. And of course, as we know, mortgage rates have been, we thought they were no way they could go any lower than they were a year ago. And then here, even, in the midst of the pandemic, we started to go up a little bit and then they've dropped to again, we keep saying it, historically unprecedented levels. The Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast right now is that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate will stay below 3.5% all the way through the end of next year. And I would say that if you didn't get a chance to attend the Kansas Economic Outlook Conference yesterday, go to the CEDBR website. CEDBR for Center for Economic Development and Business Research, and look for cedbr.org, and look for the video of Esther George's presentation yesterday. Esther George is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and she gave a great presentation that I thought really gave some keen insights into how the Fed is thinking about about interest rates generally going forward as we come through this pandemic. So, mortgage rates obviously right now are putting a really, really strong positive impact into the housing market. And so what's been interesting here is that, even though homeowners aren't really being, people who are potential homeowners aren't being heavily affected by the job losses yet, and even though interest rates are incredibly low, we've really seen home sales activity across most markets in the state effectively plateauing. And our forecast for that is that home sales are going to rise ever so slightly this year, 1% up to 41,470 units in this year, and then fall slightly next year as we see some of the impacts of the unemployment rate begin to take hold. But the reason why we haven't been seeing home sales increase isn't because of dampened demand at this point. It's really because of a lack of inventory. And you all are very acutely aware of that. Right now, statewide, we are at a place where the month's supply, where we take active listings divided by the average pace of sales over the past year, we're now at less than a 2-month supply. And of course, we think of a balanced market as being between a 4 and 6 month supply. So this is really a stunningly low level of inventory. And what's even more striking with it is that we've been in extremely tight inventories in the more modestly priced homes. I picked some arbitrary cut points here where you might define the lower end of the market, the mid, the upper middle, and the top of the market would vary based on which market you're in. But for the state as a whole, I picked 100, 250,000, and 500,000 as sort of my break points. And of course, in that most popular intensive price range, 100 to 250,000, we've been bouncing around the 2-month supply point for about 3 years now. What we've seen is that even in the other price points now, we're dropping down to that two-month supply range. And at the upper end of the market, this is what's most striking. Where it had been perhaps more leaning towards a buyer's market for very high-priced homes, we're now to a place where in most markets across the state, it's balanced, or even in some cases, we've tipped over into what might be considered a seller's market range in those higher-end homes. And so that, I think, personally, has been driven primarily by the fact that the high-income buyers are not really being affected by COVID and their job situations are not being dampened. Number two, mortgage rates are making it such that people can afford more and they can lock in more than they ever dreamed was possible before. Well, as you know, we forecast 3 different numbers for all the markets across the state. Home sales activity is the first. The second one is home price appreciation. And so, as you can imagine, when you have demand that still remains very strong, again, concerns about the future, but right now demand is still very strong, and tight inventories, we should be seeing strong home price appreciation. And across most of the state, that seems to be the case. We're projecting that home prices are still going to appreciate this year at about 4.8% and another 5.7% by the end of next year. And again, that's really strong home price appreciation. People in California may think that's nothing, but in Kansas, that's a really strong number. And it's really reflecting the fact that we haven't had very much inventory being added to the market to really offset the declines from sales that we've had over the last several years. And so the final number that we forecast is new home construction. And for many years, I've been saying we're still struggling to see new home construction take off. I think we're finally at a point where we're beginning to see that happen. Especially in the larger markets in Wichita and in Kansas City, we're seeing really big surges in building permitting activity. And that, I think, is being driven by the fact that underlying existing home prices, especially in the upper end of that modest market, have gotten high enough that it's a little bit easier for new homes to compete, to build something at those more modest price points and have it be competitive. Again, you also have the impact of low rates. People who may have said, I don't want to go into new homes are now maybe saying, oh, if I can get what I want and lock in the rate, they're willing to go in and do that. All of that is coming together to really begin to unlock new home construction activity across most markets in the state. And so that is our summary of our forecast. We expect that home sales activity will essentially plateau and then fall off just a little bit next year, but that's not much different from where we've been the last several years. My concerns about long-term impacts on the housing market are just that, long-term concerns. I tend to not believe that we're going to see a Nike swoosh recovery. And I think it's going to be a longer term process for us to regain jobs. And I think that's especially true in Kansas because a lot of our job losses have been in a manufacturing base that have been really impacted, especially in Wichita, where we have the aviation manufacturing that had already hit, a couple of different body blows prior to the onset of the pandemic. But the housing market's well positioned to withstand a decline in demand because inventories are so tight. And so even if demand slacks off next year and in the following year, we're still in a situation where that would only make it balanced. And so home sales activity shouldn't be too severely impacted by that. And home price appreciation we forecast to continue to be strong, which is helping to spur new home construction. Questions? While we're waiting for those, I'll just show you. We do have summary forecasts for all of the major markets. And once again, these publications, again, really pleased with the way they looked out. My graphic designer and I have a wonderful time putting these together. These should be available in your board offices later today. I'd encourage you to pick up multiple copies, boxes if you need to have them on hand they make great additions to listing presentations or for relocation packets. I think it's really good information, especially right now with the uncertainty facing the pandemic and how are we continuing to be so robust despite the fact that we're in a really severe recession at this point. So I hope you take advantage of those. And again, I hope that you make sure that you thank the sponsors of those presentations. So, did we get any questions, Heather?
Yes. Josie says that's a pretty optimistic view of it being balanced next year. You don't think it's going to swing the other way?
I think it will become less. I think that the inventories will ease a little bit. So instead of having a 2-month supply, if we got up to a 3 to 3.5 month supply, that's still a really tight market. And I don't see us going to a place where we're going to end up having an absolute crash in the housing market. I just think that is an extraordinarily unlikely scenario. There'd have to be a lot of different things that happened in order for that to occur.
And then, do you think a shutdown of the economy is likely to repeat?
Okay, so that's a really good question. My biggest fear when the shutdowns first occurred was that we were going to get into this whipsaw pattern. I wasn't a big fan of complete draconian shutdowns. Obviously, they had a unique situation in New York because of you have to be very concerned about what happened in, say, Italy and in New York, where emergency rooms get overwhelmed and so forth. And that's a different story. But for most of the economy, that was not the case. And I was always much more in favor of very targeted behaviors that would end up, lots of testing, tracking, and really doing targeted shutdowns where they need to happen in order to help prevent these severe outbreaks. What I feel has happened over the last 6 months is that we really have moved to more of that mode of operation. We're trying to be more balanced. It's obviously extraordinarily politicized on both ends of the spectrum, but I hope that most of us are recognizing that, if we can do simple things like wear masks or try and be respectful in terms of our interactions to limit the chances that there is a big outbreak, that will help keep us from having to be in a place like they were in New York or in Italy, where they had to go into draconian shutdowns. And so I'm actually optimistic that we will not have that happen. There may be individual cases in some targeted locations. Could we end up shutting down as the university? Sure, that could happen. I don't expect it. But us shutting down as the university, saying no one on campus, wouldn't necessarily mean that everyone in Sedgwick County had to be shut down in that way. I think things will be more targeted, and that will help minimize the very severe impacts, the worst impacts that would come economically.
All right, then we have, did you say that the absorption rate in the high end is also approaching a seller's market? And do you feel it will improve any further with that segment?
So in at least one market, and you'll have to forgive me, I forget which. I think it was the Kansas City market, but I may be misremembering. I don't have it sitting right in front of me. In at least one of the markets, the high-end absorption rate has actually dropped down to about a 4-month supply. Again, not dropped into what we would call statistically a seller's market, but certainly far away from the buyer's market. Now, I want to give a big caveat here. I put some arbitrary cut points for the upper end of the market. There's a big difference between, say, a $600,000 home and a $1 million home and a $2 million home. And so even within these ranges, again, it's what I always tell to my students, what I tell to consumers, nobody owns the average home. And so all of the averages in the world don't necessarily have any relevance to you specifically. And that's why it's important in working through these transactions to work with somebody who has a great deal of experience in knowing how your property fits in the overall market. And so with that, individual homes may be very different. And that's where the job is on your shoulders as realtors to really help potential sellers understand how they fit within that. If there are no other questions, I'm around and available if people want to reach out to me with further questions later. But otherwise, I'll say farewell and thank you very much.